Every single morning, she was there, right there on your screen, steady as a heartbeat, warm as a kitchen light left on for someone coming home late. Savannah Guthrie, a name that meant something, a face that meant safety. For millions of Americans, she wasn't just on the television. She was part of the morning itself, woven into the first hour of the day the way coffee is, the way sunlight through a window is. And then one day, something changed. The news moved fast, the way news always does now. People stopped mid-scroll. Colleagues went pale. Fans felt something shift in their chests that they couldn't quite name, but absolutely could not ignore. What was happening to the woman who had anchored them through everything? Welcome back to Cold Case History. I am going to walk you through every detail of this case. The footage, the forensics, the suspect behavior, the DNA, and the digital evidence trail. If you are new here, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. We cover every update on cases like this one the moment they break. And trust me, this one is not finished breaking yet. Let's begin at the beginning. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't the usual churn of celebrity noise that passes through your feed and disappears by lunch. This was different. This landed differently. Because Savannah Guthrie had never been just a broadcaster. She had been a presence. The kind of person who could look into a camera in the middle of the worst news cycle in a generation and somehow make you feel like the ground beneath your feet was still solid. She delivered hard truths for a living. And now she was the story she never asked to be part of. A story about limits. About faith. About what happens to a person when the cameras finally go dark and real life rushes in to fill the silence. Before you assume you already know where this is going, stay with it. Because what actually happened is not what the headlines suggested. And it will sit with you long after this ends. There is a specific kind of person who can walk into a room of millions and make every single one of them feel personally seen. Not performing. Not broadcasting from behind a wall of professionalism. Actually connecting. That was Savannah Guthrie's gift. And it didn't fall from the sky. It was built slowly, over decades, through sacrifice and loss and a brand of quiet resilience that most of her viewers never once suspected was there, because she never asked for credit for it. She came into the world in Melbourne, Australia, where her father was working at the time, but she was raised in the American Southwest, in Tucson, Arizona. Her family gave her something more durable than wealth or connections. They gave her values, education, faith, the kind of backbone that doesn't bend even when everything around it does. She lost her father when she was just 16 years old. 16. At an age when most teenagers are still figuring out who they are, Savannah Guthrie was already learning how to grieve without disappearing. How to keep her footing when the earth has fundamentally shifted beneath her feet. And she did. She kept going. She immersed herself in school, in purpose. In the future, she was still brave enough to believe in despite everything. She went to the University of Arizona, graduated with honors, and then did something that most people who end up in television simply never bother to do. She went to law school, Georgetown University Law Center. She passed the bar. She became a licensed attorney, not as a backup plan, not as a status symbol, but because she genuinely believed that understanding the world deeply mattered more than simply looking good inside it. That foundation, that intellectual and emotional architecture, became the bedrock of everything she would eventually build on camera. She didn't walk onto the Today Show set as a lucky face with a gift for small talk. She walked in as someone who had already survived things that would have unraveled others. And that's what made her different. That's what made her real. When you watched her on that screen, you weren't watching a character carefully assembled for ratings. You were watching a woman who had genuinely been through it, who understood, in her bones, what it meant to lose something irreplaceable and still show up the next morning anyway. Audiences could feel that. They trusted her not because she was polished, though she absolutely was, but because underneath the polish, there was unmistakable weight. The weight of someone who had actually lived. And then the news broke. And millions of people who had quietly let her into their mornings for years suddenly found themselves sitting with a question they didn't know how to answer. What happens when the person who holds everything together is the one who needs holding? To understand what actually happened, you have to go back further than the headlines ever did. Back to a moment that most people barely registered at the time. A quiet admission, delivered almost in passing during a live broadcast, that for those who were truly paying attention, sounded like a very small alarm going off in the middle of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. She had mentioned fatigue. Not the ordinary exhaustion that comes with early alarms and long days. She had plenty of that. This was something different. Something that didn't lift after a weekend. Something that didn't respond to any of the usual remedies. And she said it the way strong people always do, briefly, lightly, like it was a footnote rather than a headline. But Savannah Guthrie had never been someone who let the curtain slip. She was the journalist. She asked the hard questions. She didn't field them about herself. So when she mentioned it, The people who were truly paying attention noticed. And then came the eye. In 2016, during an ordinary playful moment with her young son, a toy struck her eye and caused serious damage to her retina, severe enough to genuinely threaten her vision permanently. For a woman whose entire career existed in front of cameras, whose work depended on her ability to read, to see, to be fully and sharply present in every moment, this was not a setback. This was a crisis. And yet she didn't vanish. She didn't retreat behind closed doors and issue statements from a distance. She told her audience. She was honest. She continued to show up for work while privately managing the very real and terrifying possibility that she might lose sight in one eye. That kind of courage is easy to admire from a distance. It is another thing entirely to understand what it truly costs from the inside. The months following that injury were a quiet storm. Multiple surgeries, specialist consultations, a life quietly restructured around a new and unwelcome uncertainty. And through all of it, she kept anchoring. She kept being the calm, familiar face that millions of people expected to see when they turned their televisions on in the morning. But here is what the broadcast never captured. The nights were hard. The doubt was real. There were moments, and she has acknowledged this in rare and honest interviews, where she genuinely didn't know whether her vision would recover, where she sat in the dark, literally and figuratively, and had to reach for a reason to keep going. She found it in faith. Savannah has spoken openly about her Christian beliefs over the years, and during this period, that faith became something far deeper than a background conviction. It became the thing she held on to when everything else felt uncertain. And her family, her husband Michael Feldman, her daughter Vale, her son Charlie, became the gravity that kept her from drifting entirely into fear. This is the chapter of her story that rarely gets told in full. Not the career milestones, not the broadcast achievements, not the high-profile interviews that shaped the national conversation, but the quiet, ordinary, achingly human reality of a woman trying to hold herself together while the stakes of her personal life became devastatingly high. And this, as hard as it already was, this was only the beginning of the chapter that would test her most. There is an unwritten rule inside television. You do not show weakness. You project clarity, authority, steadiness. You smile through the hard days. You deliver difficult news without flinching. You are the constant in a world of variables. Savannah Guthrie understood that rule better than almost anyone. She had built her career on being reliable, unshakable, present, and for years she honored that rule flawlessly. But there is a cost attached to that, a hidden and rarely discussed cost that lives on the other side of all that televised grace. For years, her alarm was set for 3:30 in the morning. 3:30. While the rest of New York was still sleeping, she was already preparing to carry the day's news into millions of homes. That kind of schedule doesn't merely tire a person. It reshapes them. It restructures their entire relationship with time, with rest, with the basic human rhythms the body was built to follow. And when you lay that schedule on top of serious health challenges, surgical recoveries, and lingering uncertainty, what you are left with is a person running on reserves they can barely afford to spend. People who worked closely alongside Savannah during this period described someone who was focused, absolutely, professional, without question, but quieter off camera than her on-air presence ever suggested. More inward. More careful, like someone who had learned through hard and specific experience to guard the parts of herself the camera could never reach. Then came 2020. And if the years before had tested Savannah, what followed tested everything in her. The COVID-19 pandemic did not simply change the world. It changed television in ways that no one was remotely prepared for. And Savannah, alongside her co-anchor Hoda Kotb, had to anchor a nation that was terrified, grieving, and desperate for something solid enough to hold on to. The pressure of that assignment is almost impossible to overstate. These were not abstract stories. Every segment touched someone's real life. Every headline represented families separated, livelihoods destroyed, worlds turned entirely upside down. And Savannah had to deliver all of it clearly, compassionately, professionally, while navigating the same fear and uncertainty as every single person watching her from their kitchen table. She has spoken carefully and honestly about the pandemic years being among the most difficult of her entire professional life. Not because of logistics, though those were genuinely brutal, but because of the weight of the responsibility. Because every morning she sat in that chair, she was acutely aware that how she said things, what she chose to emphasize, what tone she brought to the room, all of it mattered in ways that felt almost unbearably significant. And still she showed up. Still she delivered. Still she looked into that camera and found a way to be steady. But the question no one was asking, the one that would eventually become impossible to ignore, was quietly accumulating beneath all of that steadiness. How long can a person run on pure will before something finally gives? The answer arrived without fanfare. It didn't come with a press release or a dramatic announcement. It arrived the way most real turning points do, quietly and without ceremony, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary week. Savannah began stepping back. Not completely, not all at once, but the absences became noticeable. The substitutions became more frequent. And in an industry where consistency is everything, where audiences build near-daily relationships with the faces on their screens, even small shifts get noticed immediately. Fans started talking. Comment sections filled with concern. Colleagues responded to questions with carefully practiced neutrality. And the silence from the network, protective, understandable, professionally appropriate, somehow made everything feel heavier rather than lighter. Because when someone you have trusted every morning for years is not where she is supposed to be, the imagination rushes in to fill the space. People began to wonder, not out of malice, not out of gossip, out of genuine attachment to someone who had become genuinely part of their daily lives. That is the strange and powerful intimacy of morning television. The audience didn't just watch Savannah. They had breakfast with her. They made their coffee while she spoke. They began their days inside the familiar rhythm of her presence. And so her absence was not simply a news story. For many people, it felt like a friend who had quietly gone without explanation. If you're still here, subscribe, because cases like this only work when people stay. And tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing my global family represent. Drop your country or city in the comments. What was actually unfolding behind the scenes was far more layered than any single headline could contain. Savannah was navigating a convergence of things. Professional exhaustion that had been building for years. Ongoing health considerations that never fully resolved. And the kind of deep personal reckoning that tends to arrive for high-achieving people somewhere in their mid-40s and early 50s. Quiet and persistent and impossible to outrun. That reckoning doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a diagnosis or a clean narrative arc. It comes as a question. A question that grows louder the longer it goes unanswered. What is all of this actually for? Who am I when the performance stops? What does my life look like when the studio lights go down, the makeup comes off, and I am just a person, not an anchor, not a public figure, just a person sitting quietly inside her own existence? Those are not small questions. For someone whose identity had been so profoundly shaped by her public role and by the expectations of millions of people, asking them at all required genuine courage. Asking them in an industry that rewards certainty and penalizes vulnerability was a form of bravery that deserved far more recognition than it ever received. But Savannah Guthrie had always known how to be brave in quiet rooms long before anyone gave her credit for it. That much had never changed. There is a version of this story that follows the familiar arc of the cautionary tale. The brilliant person who burns bright and then burns out. The public figure whose gifts eventually get consumed by the machine built around them. Television loves that story. It fits neatly. But that is simply not Savannah Guthrie's story. Because what emerged from this period of stepping back, of asking the hard questions, of sitting with the discomfort of genuine uncertainty, was not a woman undone by pressure. It was a woman recalibrating with extraordinary intention. She began speaking more openly about faith. Not preaching, never imposing, but sharing honestly about the role her spiritual life played in keeping her grounded when everything external felt unstable. She spoke about her children differently now, more tenderly. More specifically, not as a footnote to her career, but as the central defining fact of who she was and what she was actively, deliberately building. Vale and Charlie had become the most important story of her life, and she was no longer willing to keep that story entirely off-screen. She began speaking, carefully but clearly, about the very real human cost of morning television. The early mornings that never stop. The relentless news cycles. The constant expectation of presence. She didn't campaign loudly. She didn't make it a crusade. But in small and honest moments she allowed herself, she made one thing unmistakably clear. Even the strongest people have limits. And acknowledging those limits is not weakness. It is wisdom earned the hard way through years of genuinely lived experience. And then, steadily and with purpose, she came back. Not as a diminished version of herself. Not as someone pieced imperfectly back together after a breaking point. But as someone who had gone through something genuinely real and emerged from it with a clearer and more settled sense of what mattered and exactly why. Colleagues noticed a shift. A warmth that had always been present became more deliberate. A focus that had always been professional became deeply personal. She seemed, in the words of people who worked alongside her daily, more fully herself. Less performing the role and more truly inhabiting it. Her interviews deepened. Her questions carried more emotional intelligence. Her willingness to sit inside a difficult moment on camera rather than rushing past it toward the next segment became something audiences responded to instinctively, even if they couldn't always articulate why. What they were responding to was authenticity. The real, lived, genuinely costly kind. Not the curated kind that gets packaged and sold. The kind that is forged in private, in the hours no camera ever captures. In the moments when a person must decide again and again and again who they are and what they stand for, and whether the price of showing up fully is still one they are willing to pay. Savannah had made that decision, and the proof was in the work, in the presence, in the woman who sat behind that desk every morning and still, after everything, found a way to make millions of people feel like the world was going to be okay. There are people in our lives, sometimes people we have never actually met, who quietly become part of how we understand the world, part of the architecture of our daily existence. And we don't always realize how much they matter until something shifts, until the familiar presence is suddenly absent and we finally feel the shape of the space it leaves behind. Savannah Guthrie is that person for millions of Americans, not because she is famous, but because she showed up consistently, authentically, bravely, even when it cost her something real that no one in the audience ever knew about. Her story is not a cautionary tale. It is not a tragedy. It is something rarer and more valuable than either. It is a story about endurance that doesn't look heroic from the outside, about the quiet, unglamorous, deeply personal work of rebuilding yourself while the world keeps watching and expecting you to be fine, about choosing every single morning to show up anyway. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who carries far more than they ever show, don't just scroll past. Leave a comment below and tell us what moved you about this one. Share it with someone who needs to hear that strength and struggle are not opposites. They are the same story told from different angles. And if you have made it to the end of this video, subscribe right now and turn on every notification, because this channel is built for people who stay, for people who want the full story, told with honesty and depth and the kind of respect that every real human life deserves. There are more stories coming. Stories that will challenge you, move you, and remind you that the most extraordinary lives are almost always lived quietly beneath the surface of what the world gets to see. Hit subscribe. Stay with us, because the next one is already waiting.